Hello guys, and welcome back to another video. In this video we're going to be going over Jeff Nippard's video on the 5 different steps or levels of muscle building. We're going to be going over how you can start building muscle as a beginner all the way up to elite level bodybuilder, and analyzing what he has to say for each level. So without further ado, let's go into the video.
Alright guys, so here we are. Fix up my camera real quick and let's see what Jeff Nippard has to say on the different levels of muscle building.
In this video, I'm going to explain how to build muscle in 5 levels of increasing complexity, starting with the most basic explanation and getting more detailed as we go.
He's pretty much going to explain the
preparing
video
this
here.
video, I consulted with a number of different experts, including a
Different
professor
experts
in
I'm gonna
muscle
talk to.
metabolism, an industry leader in the field of biomechanics,
Just
and an
quickly
active research.
skip to where the video really starts.
Alright, so building muscle is actually pretty simple. All you really need to do is lift weights and eat protein.
Very
protein,
true.
of course, being the macronutrient found in foods like fish, chicken,
Protein,
meat, dairy,
remember, is made out of
beans,
amino
lentils,
acids. There's
protein
9
powder.
essential amino
And when you
acids.
weight train, your muscles
So
start
you
to
want your
think,
protein
well,
to be
if I'm gonna
coming
keep lifting these
from
heavy weights,
complete
I better
proteins,
start to get some bigger
which
muscles
have all 9
to make this easier.
essential amino
This is
acids.
called an adaptive response, and it's kind of like when you play guitar. Your fingertips start to get harder and grow calluses as an adaptive
Very true.
response to pressing against the strings.
Alright guys, so we're back. Had to cut out for a sec. Room service, but now we're back. So let's get to it.
It hurts at first, but then it gets easier as you build the thicker skin layer.
Very good
Lifting weights isn't quite enough on its own
demonstration
to build
on
muscle.
how it works.
To build something, you need building blocks. And when it comes to
Exactly.
muscle, the building blocks are called amino acids, which you get by eating protein. So when you lift weights, you're telling the muscle it needs to get bigger, and when you eat protein, you're giving the muscle the
fuel.
building blocks it needs to actually grow.
It's a construction site. You're getting all the blocks in the construction.
So, in reality, it's probably not
So-
quite good enough to just lift weights and eat protein to get really solid results. For example,
need
if you're lifting the exact same weight,
train.
the exact same reps 2 years from now that you lifted
This
today,
guy's now he's
probably
gonna go to
won't be good
progressive
enough to keep your
overload.
muscle growing.
You
Sure,
need to
you'll see some decent
do
growth
little
at the
tears in the
beginning because
muscles
you've
to
never
fill them up,
lifted
to
any
then
weight
fill them
before.
up with
But
protein
soon
amino
enough, that
acids, so
weight
then
will
they
no
grow and
longer
get
be
bigger.
challenging enough to present a sufficient stimulus for your muscle to continue growing. This is why we need to expand the lift weights part to lift weights with an emphasis on progressive overload. Now, the technical
true.
definition of progressive overload is the gradual increase of stress on the muscles during weight training. But we can simply think of it as just increasing some training parameter over time. So from workout to
Typically
workout, you
weight.
want to add a little bit of weight or add an extra rep using the same weight. For example, let's say you're trying to grow your biceps. Rather than doing 3 sets of 10 reps with the same weight week after week and month after month, it'd be
Add a
much
rep
more effective to
every
do 3
week.
sets of 10 reps in week 1, 3 sets of 11 in week 2, 3 sets of 12 in week 3, and then in week 4, you can go back to 10 reps again, but this time add a little more weight. Now, at a
Very
certain
true.
point, you may not be able to increase the weight.
It's more or less what I
each and
do.
every time,
Get up to
and that's
12 reps
okay.
and then increase
There's
the
still
weight a
other
little.
ways to apply progressive overload, such as by adding an extra set with the same reps and the same weight, or even by doing something as
Very
simple as
good.
controlling the negative a little better, or feeling a stronger mind-muscle connection, where you more consciously feel the
Which,
muscle
if you guys have
squeezing
seen
and
my
stretching
previous
and
video
lift,
on my
or
muscle
swapping out
connection,
for a new
there's
exercise
a
and
correlation
starting
between
overload
that
process
helping
again.
you build muscle.
Also, on the nutrition side, we
So,
can do quite a bit better
does
than
have
just saying eat protein.
pretty
To be
solid
more specific, the latest research
backing
shows that we
behind
need
it.
between 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight
or
per
just
day,
about
so about
0.7.
to 1 gram per
Yeah.
pound, is a good target for maximizing muscle gain. For example, if you weigh 165
Took the
pounds
words out
or
of my mouth.
75 kilos, you'd want to be eating somewhere in the range of 120 to 165 grams of protein per day for
I always
general
try to
muscle
say
gain.
to aim
Now,
for
there may
1
be
gram
some advantage in
protein
going a bit higher in
per
certain
pound of body
advanced
weight.
situations.
Just in general,
This is
a lot of
sufficient
people
range
don't get
for most. Now, if you're very
pure
high in body
protein
fat, the grams per
sources.
unit
For
body
example,
weight
you're
approach
eating
won't work as well.
or
So let's say you're
complete
300 pounds, you
proteins.
don't really need 300 grams of protein per day. So in that
Since
case,
people
I
are
simply
getting
prefer
it
to use
from
1 gram of protein
sources
per
like
centimeter in
grains.
height because it works
Your bread has
independently of body
protein.
fat
It's not a
percentage.
complete
So
protein,
let's
so
say
you
you're
can't really
5'9",
count it.
or about 175 centimeters tall. 175
I always
grams
say
of
to be
protein
safe
would
and
be
just
plenty
go
you.
for 1
It's not a
gram of
perfect
protein
system,
per
but
pound of
it'll get
body
you in
weight.
the
So you
right
want to be
ballpark.
getting it from lean
And while there is some
sources.
evidence to suggest that spacing your protein across
Plus,
3 to
in
5
general,
meals
there's been some
throughout the day
research done
might be
that
more
1 gram
ideal.
per pound of
If
body
that
weight
suggestion
in
holds true, it's
bodybuilders,
certainly much
people are
less
really,
important
really
than
pushing
simply
themselves
hitting a daily protein
in the
target.
gym.
In
And
fact,
also,
contrary to common belief,
people who are
training
cutting
is a
weight
much more powerful
has
contributor to
much
muscle
greater
growth than
results.
diet, and by quite a long shot.
Or
While
not
it is
much
true
greater,
that
but
a caloric surplus
significantly
will drive muscle
superior
growth more
results
effectively,
than having
dietary
0.7
manipulations
grams
like
of
protein
protein
timing
per
can
pound of
have
body
some impact. I'm going to focus the remaining levels on maximizing the muscle response through resistance training.
Pretty good.
So, focusing on progressive overload is smart, but it still leaves a lot to be desired in the gym.
Very true.
For example, it doesn't tell us how hard we should push it, or how many sets we should do, or how many reps we should do, or how heavy we should be lifting.
As heavy
Next, I want to take a quick look at what the research says about the so-called acute training variables. Factors like effort, volume, intensity,
volume
exercise
is
selection,
weight times reps times sets.
I think effort is the most fundamental variable for growth because no matter how much
Very
you
true.
optimize all the other stuff, if you aren't pushing it hard enough, the muscle simply won't grow. At least not optimally.
Gotta
There's
push that
currently
community.
a raging debate within the scientific community about exactly how hard we should push each set. A relatively small
You
group
could
of experts
theoretically
says that all sets
leave
should be
a
taken
rep or
all the
two
way to
extra in the
muscular failure,
tank.
defined as an inability to complete another rep despite maximum effort. But I'd say that the mainstream scientific consensus is that it isn't necessary to take sets all the way to failure.
But pretty close.
You do need to be pretty close. You shouldn't be leaving more than 2 or 3 reps in the tank.
This guy knows what he's talking about.
Of course,
Everything
there are a
he's
few
saying is
exceptions where
100%
leaving
right.
5 or more reps in the tank does make sense for recovery, especially when training primarily for strength. But as a general rule, most of your sets should be pretty close to failure. So you do need to push it hard.
I
Maybe
would
harder than you
recommend
think.
just try to go to
Next,
failure
volume
if
technically
possible.
refers to the amount of work you do,
Since
and this was historically
then
calculated
there's
as
no
the
way
number
you're
of
making
sets
any sorts
times
of
the number of
mistakes.
reps times the amount of load. But as of 2015, most practitioners began to think of volume simply as the number of hard sets you do. Now, over the last few years, it's become a popular meme to think of
That
volume
is
as the, quote,
interesting. I
primary
wouldn't
driver
really
of
say that. I
hypertrophy.
agree with the first
If I ever
definition
said this,
of the
I no
second.
longer think is the case. Rather than more volume leading to more growth, what we instead see is a sort of inverted U-trend, where more volume leads to more growth only up to a point, past which further increases
Exactly.
anything extra, and then at a certain point, adding more volume seems to be counterproductive. So there's this volume sweet spot, which seems to be a bit different for everyone. And I
Very
find a lot
true.
of people are already doing more volume than they really need, and would probably benefit more by reducing their volume and focusing
Increasing
more on
the
effort
intensity.
and execution. But the main point is that you should experiment and figure out what dose of volume gives you the best balance
But
of gains
general
and
for
recovery.
volume,
Still,
12
based
to
on what we know
15
from the current
reps,
science, something around 10 to 20
3 to
sets per
5.
body part per week seems to be a good range for most people and most
no,
muscles.
wait.
So, for example, if you're running an upper-lower split that has you in the
8
gym
to 12
4 days a
reps
week,
for
your chest volume might look
hypertrophy.
something like this.
Well,
6
really no,
hard
I'd say
sets for your
5 to
chest on
15
Monday,
reps.
and 6 hard sets for
Depending
your
on
chest
what you're going for.
Thursday,
If you're going
totaling
really
12
hypertrophy
hard
based,
sets
get up
for
to
the week.
15.
Okay, next we need to
If you're
cover
going for
intensity,
strength, go to 5
which, despite
reps
its popular
and
conflation
3 to
with effort,
5
technically refers
sets
to how heavy
per
the weight
workout.
is. You can either lift heavy weights for low reps,
Or like you could
light
say
weights for
here,
high
like he
reps.
said,
But
20
what's the best for muscle
sets.
growth? Well, it turns out that as long as you're
Per
taking
week.
sets sufficiently close to failure, you can maximize hypertrophy using high reps or low reps, or a combination of both. Research has shown that reps as low as 3 and reps as high as 30 all cause similar muscle growth.
Yep,
However,
very
there
true.
does seem to be a limit to how light you can go. New data shows that when you lift
Very
weights
true.
lighter than 20% of your 1-rep max, you do see significantly less growth. But the average rep count subjects got with that load was 67 reps. Not a very practical way to train regardless. So the traditional
Exactly.
6 to 12 rep zone is kind of a myth in the sense that research shows you can go well outside that range and still grow fine as long as you're training close to muscular failure. Still, I think there is some value in that 6 to 12 range because once you start
Very
dipping down
true.
below 6 reps, you can risk unnecessary strain on your joints, and it can be practically more difficult to accumulate enough volume. And the more often you go above 12
Very
reps,
true.
the more you risk just burning yourself out, as higher rep sets are harder to recover from. So for practical purposes, I suggest splitting it up like this, with the majority of your sets coming in that 6 to 12, or maybe 15 zone, while having smaller chunks dedicated to lower reps for continued strength progression and higher reps for stimulative variety. Now, I think exercise selection and
Completely
execution is just as much an art as it is a science. Sure, I do tend to favor multi-joint compound movements like squats, presses, and rows in my
That's
own
all up
training,
to the
as
person.
they give you more hypertrophic bang for your buck by activating large amounts of muscle mass while promoting more efficient total body strength gain. And while I definitely think mastering these basic compound movements is important, single joint
Personal
isolation
preference.
exercises certainly have their place,
Yep.
especially when it comes to targeting smaller muscles like the biceps, rear delts, side delts,
Rear
and
delts
abs, which can be
primarily.
overpowered if you focus on compound lifts exclusively. Luckily, when it comes to muscle growth, there are no mandatory exercises.
Rear delts are extremely hard to
After
train
master
if you're not
basics,
focusing
it's
100%
once again
on them.
important to experiment with
And you
different
could
movements
technically
and
get some out of it from
variations
doing
to
pull-ups
figure
and
out
stuff,
what
but
works
it's
best for you,
not the
and your
easiest thing
body's
to train,
mechanics.
so.
Now, when it comes to frequency, it seems like most people have flipped from thinking that you should only train each body part once a week on a split that looks something like this, otherwise you're going to overtrain and melt your muscle away, to these days, most people thinking that if you train on a bro split like this, you're never going to make any gains at all, because science? In reality, the latest research actually shows that frequency in and of itself likely plays a relatively minor role in muscle growth, and the latest studies show similar results between hitting a body part once a week and 3+ times per week. However,
it
still
is
generally
still
recommend hitting the
beneficial.
muscle at least twice a week. And I do prefer splits like upper, lower, and full body over the traditional body part split because they typically allow for more volume per week and higher quality volumes per workout.
Push-pull legs.
As long as you've got all the other variables in place,
That's what you need. That's what almost everybody I would recommend. If you have
this is an area
of a good amount of time for working out,
than it tends to get.
do push-pull legs.
And then there are other training variables like rest periods, lifting tempo, and advanced intensity techniques make up a relatively smaller piece of the puzzle. Rather than go into detail on these, I'll just link a few videos on them down below.
Okay, and elite level.
Okay, so with progressive overload and the main acute training variables in mind, at this point I'd like to get a bit more granular and take a closer look at what's actually driving muscle growth physiologically. So in 2010, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld published a landmark paper with over 500 citations that introduced
with their
three-factor
complicated last
model
names.
of muscle hypertrophy. This model proposed that there are three main things driving muscle growth: mechanical tension, muscle damage, and metabolic stress. Now, the very short version is that mechanical tension is the type of force that tries to stretch a muscle fiber. One way to visualize this is like a tug of war.
Just like
each
stretch.
side pulls, tension is generated in the
You can
rope.
actually build muscle through
Like,
stretching, so
not only are the
that's
people
what he's
pulling
saying
on the
here.
rope, but the rope is also pulling back on the people.
Yeah.
Similar in the muscle, where tension is passively created when the muscle is stretched, and tension
Very
is
true.
actively created during contraction when actin molecules are pulled by myosin heads. And as of now, tension remains absolutely undisputed as the primary driver of hypertrophy within the scientific community at large.
Very true.
Next, muscle damage is basically exactly what it sounds like: physical damage to the muscle like micro tears and other cellular disruptions. And you can observe this under a microscope.
Even when
to see
doing the
that the normal
pulling, it
pattern in
does
muscle
have
can be
very
seriously
small
disrupted
tears.
after training. Now, some believe that this type of damage is at least partly responsible for the delayed onset muscle soreness that you can feel in the days following training, although the soreness phenomenon is no doubt caused by a number of factors and still isn't fully understood. Still, for years, many people have just assumed that getting sore should be the goal of training, since soreness comes from muscle damage, and muscle damage causes muscle growth. But the latest science shows that
not
the first claim is
necessarily.
questionable, and the second claim is most likely not true. Of course, the most common sense way to think about this is that running a marathon would cause tons of muscle damage, but wouldn't do anything good for muscle growth. In fact, a review paper from Wackeridge and colleagues pointed out that, if anything,
too much volume.
damage in this context would seem to decrease muscle growth. And even in a weight training context, damage doesn't seem to be doing much good. The study from Damas and colleagues argued that damage doesn't even correlate with hypertrophy over the long run. As shown in the figure here, early on in a training program, you see a huge amount of damage. This could be why you get so sore when starting a new routine.
Very true.
And while there is an associated early spike in muscle protein synthesis, the
Well,
vast
you
majority
feel
of that
it
synthesis
less
is
more.
directed toward repairing damaged muscle tissue rather than building new muscle tissue from scratch. And it's only after that damage decreases that muscle protein synthesis is directed toward new muscle hypertrophy. And while folks playing devil's advocate
That's why
could
by
argue, well, studies show that
fourth
eccentric training
week of
causes
training,
muscle
you build
damage.
way more muscle.
Studies also show that eccentric training causes
But you
muscle
also,
growth.
in
I
general,
would simply respond with
after
correlation
a
doesn't
year,
imply
like
causation.
new begins everything,
It
so
seems
you
more
won't
likely to
be
me that the extra growth that
always
you see
building
from
as much
eccentric
as you do at the
overloading
beginning
could simply be
after
coming
a
from
certain
the
amount of
fact that you
time.
can simply overload
It
the
is
muscle more
interesting what
heavily
he's saying.
during an eccentric contraction, causing more tension
that
in the
means
muscle.
that
Now, I should say
you're
that if we're being really honest, we don't
not
actually
100%
understand
sure.
muscle damage all that well. Even the methods of simply measuring muscle damage have been contested by prominent researchers.
In general, I
bottom
would
line
say
is that
muscle
any theory that
damage
uses
does
muscle
promote
damage to explain
muscle
muscle growth is speculative at best and unfeasible at worst. But what about metabolic stress? Well, metabolic stress refers to the accumulation of metabolites like lactate and hydrogen ions and the muscle hypoxia that often follows weight
That's
training.
how when
It's
you're
often
doing
associated
abs or
with the massive
something,
skin-tearing pumps that
and
you
you're
get from high
really
rep workouts.
working out
So if
really,
muscle
really hard,
damage and
you
its
can't,
ensuing
like,
soreness is
I don't know how to
unlikely to
explain
promote
it.
muscle growth,
You start to
surely
feel
the pump and its
like you
associated
can't move the
metabolic
muscle
stress
anymore.
must be doing something.
And it's
I mean,
generally, I
animals
get that
seem
type
to
of feeling
recognize
when I'm
this.
doing abs.
The
So
greatest
think about
feeling
doing
you can
abs,
get in the
training
gym,
as
or the
hard
most
as you can.
satisfying feeling you can get in the gym, is the pump. Your muscles get a really tight feeling, like your skin is going to explode any minute. You know, it's really tight. It's like somebody blowing air into your muscle. It just blows up, and it feels different. It feels fantastic.
And well, while the pump does feel good and
Does
certainly
feel
can
good
make
too.
training more enjoyable and perhaps even provide some feedback that you're actually hitting the muscle that you're trying to target, it most likely isn't driving hypertrophy because there are just too many examples of where the relationship between metabolic stress and muscle growth breaks down.
Yep.
Shorter rest periods cause more metabolic stress, but significantly less muscle growth than longer rest periods. Note that there's a footnote in the description box about this. Partial range of motion causes more metabolic stress, but often less muscle growth than full range of motion. Training all the way to failure causes more metabolic stress, but at best results in equal muscle growth to stopping a few reps shy of failure. And blood flow restriction training causes tons of metabolic stress, but doesn't enhance hypertrophy on its own, and doesn't even work in conjunction with training unless the training methods are highly suboptimal. And even in this case,
so in general, what he's just trying to say here is that
one of the authors of this popular blood flow restriction study, he pointed out that any benefit seems to be tension related.
Although most of this stuff,
the impact of BFR essentially
doesn't affect the majority of lifters, even elite lifters. Most elite lifters just train and their muscles get bigger. Train consistently with a good
20 reps extra in a sense. It's the same effect. You
good rep ranges.
It just happens earlier.
So consensus is converging on
it's very interesting stuff.
Tension alone as being the primary driver.
It's trying to explain.
So it should be the primary goal of our training.
Yeah,
to tension above anything else.
Completely agree.
How do we do that? Well,
you can do full reps, partial reps on certain exercises.
Increases to the muscle itself.
Tension, time under tension. So
while using the
you want to always keep the muscle tense while training to get optimum growth
over time. Also paying attention to things like the mind-muscle connection, at least on certain exercises, and eccentric control should also.
I like what he's saying here.
Aspects of lifting have been shown to increase intramuscular tension.
Explaining muscle growth. Now this
so we know that
is probably the most
tension
complicated part. The last part was pretty complicated.
What happens next? How do we get from a mechanical stimulus like tension to a biochemical signal that commands the muscle to grow? Well, Dr. Tromelin explained this to me in terms of blocks of dominoes. He said that when one thing gets activated, it passes on the signal to the next thing, and the next thing, and so on. But if you're smart, you don't just build one chain of dominoes. You build out all these side chains so that they fall in a bunch of different directions. And it's the same thing with muscle growth. There isn't just one pathway with one outcome, but rather many different interconnected pathways with many different downstream effects. So with that in mind, let's start at the top. All right, so we lift a weight heavy enough that it creates active mechanical tension.
No, I have no idea. This guy has too much stimulus training.
Which sort of feel that the muscle is being pulled into tension and pass that signal on. Now, based on the latest research, it isn't perfectly clear exactly which molecules are doing this sensing, but the top candidates include costomeres, which are collections of proteins that sit in the muscle fiber membrane and are responsible for holding muscle fibers together.
So a lot of things here, a lot of the science in muscle building is still being developed. A lot of people still don't fully understand
in humans, and because it runs parallel to the muscle fiber
the way muscle building works. We don't understand it 100%. Although in general, the basics,
probably only at long muscle lengths.
I'd say are just
filaments, which bind to the famous actin proteins that slide during contraction.
This is going to be a little bit more confusing than helpful, I think.
And for the record, I read through the latest paper on all this sensing stuff from 2018.
mTOR.
I'll just say this area of research is not well understood yet.
Okay.
Quote the
So it's
authors
going to get to a little something that
identifying
is a
major
little bit more
hypertrophy
interesting.
stimuli and their sensors is one of the big remaining questions in exercise physiology. Still, we can paint the rest of the picture with a broad brush for now. From the mechanosensors, a signal gets sent to a beast mode molecule called mTOR, which is a major regulator of cellular growth in general.
This tells your body how much muscle it can grow.
Responsibility in making tissues bigger. From there, mTOR goes to the nucleus and tells the DNA machinery to produce a messenger RNA strand, which you can think of as a set of blueprints.
Some people have issues with their mTORs, mTOR receptors, and it causes them to create way more muscle than their bodies are naturally supposed to be making.
In a process known as translation. And this step is what we're actually talking about when we say muscle protein synthesis. Now, through this translation process, many different proteins will be synthesized. Some of which will be the big contractile proteins that make us
so the muscle, that's when the protein gets into the muscle.
mTOR proteins themselves.
This ribosome thing or whatever is, so that's what, when the protein's in the muscle, the amino acids. So the protein gets broken down, the amino acids. Then the amino acids get sent down to the ribosomes, which are in your cells, which then leads to protein muscle synthesis. This protein muscle synthesis is the process in which the proteins inside, or the amino acids inside the cells, create new cells, new muscular cells that your body uses to train. So you're making more muscle. This is the process of making more muscle. Really, only happens in your sleep, and mTOR is responsible for it. It helps regulate the amount of muscle your body produces. Since too much muscle is actually dangerous, but it's very interesting. some people think that we'll one day be able to
high in the future. Now, if this rate of
alter
synthesis exceeds the rate of breakdown, protein balance is said to be positive, and in that case, new contractile proteins are incorporated
through
into
genetic
muscle fibers,
modifications.
resulting in what's called myofibrillar hypertrophy,
Recently
leading to
testing
increased muscle
different
size overall. But
modifications with
one string
mTOR
of dominoes.
on
There's
cows.
other path that's triggered by
They've been able
amino
to
acids
get
in
really
protein
big
E.
muscular
In this
cows,
case,
and
amino
people
acids
think that
are
we could do that
transported
with
inside the
humans.
cell, and the amino
Get really
acid
buff
leucine
humans.
also activates mTOR. Now, for the record, we seem to need about 3 grams of
Although
leucine
no
to stimulate
testing on
mTOR,
humans has been
which can be
done
found
yet.
in about 20 to 25 grams of high-quality protein, although some research has shown greater anabolic responses with higher protein doses. So it may be possible to crank mTOR activity higher with more leucine, but regardless, it's important to realize that the stimulative impact of leucine is much shorter than the stimulative
Don't worry
impact
about
of weight
supplementing
training.
leucine
So for
specifically. You
maximum
don't need to get
mTOR
it from the
stimulation, you need
PCAs.
both training and
Just
leucine,
focus
with
on
leucine
getting
essentially
protein powder.
complementing the stimulative effects of weightlifting. Then
Yep.
the other 8 essential amino acids, there's 9 in total when you include leucine, make
Exactly.
their way to the ribosome, where they're used as the fundamental building blocks for creating new muscle. Now, another pathway that I'll briefly mention is that of testosterone. Now, even though modifying testosterone within the
Women
natural
and men
range
also
plays a
have that.
relatively minor
So
role in
it's
muscle
not just
growth,
something that men
when you
have.
inject high-dose testosterone, the
So
hormone
we
crosses
both-
the muscle cell membrane,
both sexes
and
have
either
it,
binds
the
to an
more
androgen
testosterone that you
receptor
have, the more
directly,
muscle you'll
or is
build.
converted to DHT, which then binds to the androgen receptor, and then that complex enters the nucleus and tells the DNA to start cranking out more blueprints, turning up that muscle protein synthetic process even more. Now, if I were
Speeds
actually
everything
discussing
up.
muscle growth with an expert,
But it's
there are
dangerous.
a lot of other things
Pushes
I'd
your
want to discuss.
body
I
past
want
what's
to at least
supposed to
mention
do.
sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So far, we've
Body
been focusing on
naturally develops
myofibrillar
only a certain
hypertrophy,
amount of
so
muscle.
the growth of actual
So that's how much
contractile
your body's
tissue,
meant
but
to
there's some good
develop.
solid evidence supporting so-called sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which is the growth of all the other stuff inside the muscle fiber, like glycogen,
Interesting.
organelles, and other non-contractile proteins.
Organelles
And I
are
might
parts of
speculate
the
that
cell.
higher rep and higher volume training
Cells
will
has
bias
like
the
its own
muscle
organs,
towards
like our body has
sarcoplasmic growth,
organs.
but then the expert, depending on how open they are to guesswork, might shut that down for lacking evidence. I'd also definitely want to talk about myonuclear addition, the idea that all this muscle protein synthetic stuff still seems to be limited by the number of nuclei or command centers that you have in your muscle cells to begin with. And so, when satellite
true.
cells that surround the muscle cell like satellites donate their nuclei, that could theoretically allow the muscle cell to crank out more new muscle protein and
Because,
build more muscle. But then the expert
more
might push
nuclei
back
equals
that
more
theory is
mitochondria, and the
actually
more
pretty
higher
speculative,
mitochondrial
and we
count
can't
per
even rightly
cell
assume that nuclei are in fact a limiting factor for
increases the
hypertrophy
rate
until
of
we get more science in
power
our
or
hands. And then
energy
a
per
curious
cell.
bystander might ask, why does any of this matter anyway?
And
Who
that
created this
leads
level of research? Maybe
to
the
more
expert would
strength.
respond by saying something like knowledge having value for its own sake. Or maybe they'd point out a few of
Well,
its many
you know what? In
negative
general, I'm gonna cut it out here since he's gonna just. This is the end of the video. He's already talked about everything he's gonna talk about. He's just gonna explain some other stuff. But I feel like the more important things that you can get from this video in general come from the first few minutes where he just talks about hypertrophy. Focus on progressive overload. I feel like this. Once you get to like the elite level, it's kind of overcomplicated. Even for elite lifters, they don't really do anything too complicated, just progressive overload. Progressive overload, 1 grams or 0.7 grams of protein per pound of body weight. I try to aim for the 1 gram more than the 0.7, and you'll be alright. So, in general, don't worry about anything else. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Please like, comment, subscribe. Go check Jeff Nippert out. Love his content. This was a little bit overly sciencey, so I hope I didn't like confuse any of you guys, but that's sometimes what happens when you watch these guys' videos. And yeah, catch you guys on the next one. Bye bye.